up to this point, we've talked about a lot of divisions of the nervous system, right? And so we can broadly break up the nervous system, starting off with what two major categories, one of the big categories. So one was peripheral nervous system, the other one was central nervous system, right? Okay, so here, central nervous system is composed of what structures? Spinal cord and brain, right? Peripheral nervous system is everything outside of that. All right, so here we're going to talk a little bit about the autonomic nervous system. Now, how is the autonomic nervous system different from some of the other systems we looked at? Well, one of the things is that it is going to be looking at pathways that are activated without our intent. All right? So here, for breaking things up, peripheral nervous system. So if we have the sensory division, what are some things that belong in the sensory division? So what are some sensory division items we put in there for the peripheral nervous system? Eyeballs, ears, hearing, specialized senses like that, where we have specialized organs. We'll talk about those next. But also, when we were thinking about that situation, trying to grab a coin out of a pocket full of coins, so being able to feel things, right? Also a lot of those receptors that are in our skin, cutaneous sensation. All right, so it's peripheral nervous system. So is this going to be a afferent or efferent pathway in sensory? Afferent means that information is going towards or away from the CNS. Towards. Has to be going towards. Afferent. So A before E. Which means the motor division is what? Efferent, right? Does that mean it's going towards or away from the central nervous system? Away, okay? And so here we had one division we looked at, which was a somatic motor division. And what's the major effector? The target of these efferent neurons? Skeletal muscle, absolutely, skeletal muscle. So these are our muscles, these effectors are going to respond based upon our intent. So this other part of this motor division are what we're going to talk about today. So here, this is called the visceral motor division, also the autonomic, meaning that we don't have intent, all right, over this control. And then you can break this up into two divisions, a sympathetic and parasympathetic, and we're going to talk about the division of these two in just a second. All right? Everybody with me? Understand, what are some of the categories we're talking about today? How the somatic motor division is different from the visceral motor division. Any questions on that? Yeah, go ahead. We don't have any intent. Yeah. There's no intent to, say, move certain amount of food from my stomach into my small intestine, right? Or something along those lines. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so here, right? So if we're looking at this motor nervous system that controls like cardiac muscle and smooth muscle, but also glands. Right? So remember, what were the effectors for the somatic motor? There was the skeletal muscle, ones that are going to contract with our intent. And so here, examples of, say, a visceral reflex is if you sense that there's too high a blood pressure, right, in blood vessels, that is going to send, so this here is going to be sent towards the central nervous system. So this pathway is what? Afferent or efferent? So yeah, afferent because sensory information is going in towards the central nervous system, right? And not surprisingly, what structure is this going to be integrated in? What does that look like? So is it the cerebrum? The medulla oblongata, right? Okay? So here, it's integrated here. So a lot of the brainstem structures are important for regulating heart rate and breathing. And it's going to send a response out. So is this going to be an afferent or an efferent pathway? Efferent is going towards a target structure, in this case cardiac muscle, which means that here is this part of the somatic or this autonomic or visceral division. Autonomic, right? So here we're transmitting this towards the heart tissue, so cardiac muscle tissue. And so if blood pressure is too high, it's going to try to lower that by reducing the pumping rate, reducing the heart rate, right? So this is an example of what we call visceral reflex. Different than that patellar tendon reflex, right, that you guys did in lab. Because the effector of that was skeletal muscle. So, like we talked about, this is important for maintaining homeostasis. The targets are going to be affected, generally are ones that are really important, like blood pressure, respiratory airflow, body temperature, and so forth. All right, all of those. So without our intent, automatically, right, is what's happening here. And the targets in these cases are going to be cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, glands. Basically, the targets for the somatic are going to be skeletal muscle. Oops. All right? All right, so we're going to start off with talking about the two divisions, the functional differences or the physiological differences between the two. All right, there's two divisions, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. A lot of times, their physiological effects are opposite of each other. Okay? So here, parasympathetic division is one involved with, say, resting and digesting. All right? So it's involved with housekeeping activities. So this is the one that's probably the dominant pathway or division being activated right now in you guys, right? Resting and digesting. Okay? So it's involved with all the things involved, or all the things that are involved with resting and digesting, such as digestion, defecation, diuresis. Do any of these terms, are they unclear to you? Are any of these terms unclear to you? So diuresis is what? Urine output. Okay? All right? So here you could also, the mnemonic, so SLUD, salivation, lacrimation, urination, defecation. Any of those terms unfamiliar to you? Lacrimation, tears, tear production. Okay? Right? So everything that's involved with resting and digesting. All right? And so here, a lot of this is digestion, defecation, diuresis, a lot of the housekeeping stuff. The other division is a sympathetic division. This is involved with fight or flight response, right? So we're talking about, say, maybe the E division. This parasympathetic, you think about the D division, all those words that start with D. Here, the sympathetic is involved with excitement, all right? Going to be also emergency, exercise, embarrassment, all of those. Okay? So maybe this time on Tuesday, you felt a little bit more of this part of the autonomic nervous system, seeing some nodding heads, right? Yeah. So here, this sympathetic nervous system is involved with fight or flight. So if you're out hiking in the woods and you see a bear, right, you're going to be activating the sympathetic nervous system. So here, hopefully you can kind of imagine that a lot of the responses from these two divisions are opposite of each other, right? So here, you're going to have opposite effects on a lot of these effectors between the two divisions. All right, so let's take a look at some of the effects of these two divisions. So the parasympathetic division, resting and digesting. We'll take a look at that one first. So here, what do you think is going to be increased? Right? If you're resting and digesting. So all those D words, you go back. So if you think about salivary glands, are they increased output? Is that helping you digest? Yeah, absolutely, right? So what about gastrointestinal movement? Yeah, that should go up, right? Urine formation. So diuresis, that should go up, right? What about decreased? What would we list over here? What should be decreased? So think about all the things that sympathetic nervous system activated. The parasympathetic would want to decrease those because they're opposite of each other, right? So let's think about heart rate. If you're resting and digesting, should that go up? No, it should go down, right? Okay, so that's a classical example. Now, resting and digesting, what about metabolic rate? You're resting and digesting. So you're chilling, right? Okay. So your metabolic rate going up or down? Probably down, right? Are you trying to store glucose? Yeah, absolutely. So we're trying to store glucose, which means, are we trying to make glycogen in the liver? Or trying to break it up into glucose molecules so they can be released in the bloodstream? What do you think? Store it, right? So we're stitching together the glucose molecules to make glycogen in the liver. Okay? So all of those things are resting and digesting, right? So here, urination and defecation, saliva production, digestion activity. Not surprisingly, in order to do a lot of the digestion and then the absorption of those nutrients, you need blood flow to the gastrointestinal tract and a lot of visceral organs. Okay? Now, if you remember the cranial nerve number 10, the vagus nerve, it's a major parasympathetic nerve. So if you remember back to the schematic, it innervates a whole bunch of the viscera in the abdominal pelvic cavity, right? So it's a major pathway by which these structures are innervated, and so that's a major, was it afferent or efferent nerve? If these are the effectors, the intestines, is it coming from the central nervous system or towards the central nervous system? From, okay, is that afferent or efferent? Efferent, right? So here, the vagus nerve activity goes up in order to do a lot of these other things. Okay? All right? Now, one of the things is, if you take a look at breathing, right? So bronchioles. So if we're kind of having our metabolic rate go down, what would we expect from our bronchioles? Are we going to be breathing faster? Should we dilate them so we can get more oxygen in there? Probably not, right? So they should probably shrink. So not surprising that bronchioles in the lungs, they're going to constrict. There's also going to be pupils, okay, or can also be constricted here. All right, so what's decreased? Well, a lot of things that decrease we're going to see are associated with the sympathetic nervous system, right, as well. So the metabolic rate, we should see that go down. Blood glucose, that should go down because we're trying to store nutrients because we're resting and digesting. Store them for later in case we're out hiking and we see a bear, right? Okay. Breathing rate should go down. That is coupled with the bronchioles being constricted. Blood flow to skeletal muscles, right? So here, if you're out hiking and you see a bear, you probably don't need a lot of blood flow to your skeletal muscles, if you're resting and digesting versus, if you're trying to escape from something, all right? Heart rate and blood pressure. Hopefully this makes sense. For resting and digesting, and all these other things are going down, your heart rate and blood pressure should also go down, right? Do any of these, not make sense to you? So parasympathetic, all resting and digesting. Hopefully they all seem like, they fall into that category. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, this is parasympathetic. So when you're stressed, the sympathetic. So there's another component that's superimposed on this, which is part of the limbic system, that starts influencing over what we're talking about, right? Yeah, and it's a really good point because when we oversimplify this, you don't necessarily talk about what's happening with the emotional response that imposes itself over some of these sympathetic versus parasympathetic innervation pathways. Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah. All right. So this should, oh, sorry, Cody, you had your hand up? Yeah. Yeah, okay. So hopefully this will make sense to you. So here, what we're going to list for a sympathetic is kind of reverse of what we just listed for the parasympathetic. So here, what goes up? Well, heart rate, blood pressure, breathing rate, blood flow to skeletal muscles. All right. Metabolic rate, blood glucose, so glycogen is no longer being formed, it's being broken down and released in the bloodstream, or the glucose coming from glycogen is, and then also sweat production. All right. Now, some of the major hormones, okay, that are going to be released are norepinephrine, epinephrine here, into the bloodstream. Okay. Now, hopefully, what we're going to see decrease is a lot of what we saw increase with the parasympathetic nervous system, right? So what do we see increase with the parasympathetic nervous system? Resting and digesting. So diuresis, defecation, digestion, all of those should be suppressed, decreased, right? Okay, so saliva production, digestion activity, blood flow to the visceral organs should go down, and then urination and defecation, right? Now, what are, instead of being constricted, are going to be dilated, right? So here, the bronchioles should undergo dilation, so they get larger in diameter, so that we get more oxygen flow, right? Because we're increasing blood flow to skeletal muscle, and we know skeletal muscle needs a lot of ATP production that comes from aerobic respiration, right? And then pupils are also going to get dilated. So why is that going to be helpful if you're out there and you see something, like a bear while you're hiking? Yeah, so, if you dilate your pupils, what if it's twilight, right? You dilate your pupils, you're more likely to be able to see better, an exit route, for instance, okay? Right? So hopefully some of this is intuitive, right? It makes sense. So you can see here what parts that get activated, increased, decreased, or constricted, or dilated here are opposite of what we saw for the parasympathetic. So there's kind of two sides of the same autonomic nervous system coin. All right? Okay, so here, somatic versus the autonomic. So what am I talking about here? Remember what we said. Somatic, the effector is what? Skeletal muscle. Here, the effectors, the targets are going to be cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. Both cases, the signal starts off in the central nervous system. The neuron that was used in the somatic nervous system was the motor neuron, right? It had its cell body, okay, in the spinal cord, and it was coming out of what horn, dorsal or ventral? So ventral, right? Okay, dorsal is going to be sensory, D before V, right? So ventral comes out, and it goes all the way to the target, right? The effector, in this case, skeletal muscle. Okay? Now, with the autonomic nervous system, it's a little bit different. In order to get from the central nervous system, okay, to the effector, right, there's actually a synapse, So you need two neurons. You got one that starts off in the spinal cord, and then there's a synapse, and then there's a second neuron that carries the rest of that signal to the effector. So that's one of the major anatomical differences between the somatic and the autonomic nervous system. So here, the synapse, what structures do we have in there? Well, we don't have myelinated axons. We have cell bodies and dendrites, right? And axon terminus. And so here in the peripheral nervous system, right, because we're outside of the spinal cord now, remember that collection of gray matter is called a ganglia, right? Plural, ganglion, singular, right? So here, this is an autonomic ANS ganglia, right? Ganglion, okay, where we have synapsing going on. So we could say this neuron, we could say it's a presynaptic neuron, but we could also call it a preganglionic neuron too, right? Okay? It leads to this ganglia, or it leads to the synapse. The second neuron that continues carrying that information to the effector, we can call it a postsynaptic neuron or a postganglionic neuron. Everybody with me on that terminology? Right? So here the ganglion in the autonomic nervous system is just a collection of where we have synapsing going on, where information is going to be passed from a presynaptic neuron to a postsynaptic neuron, right? Preganglionic to postganglionic. Now, how is it going to do that? So how do we pass information from one neuron to the next? What do we use? We talked a lot about it last time, last section. So neurotransmitters, absolutely, right? Okay, so the cell body, remember, for the preganglionic neuron starts in the central nervous system. The cell body for the postganglionic neuron starts in the the peripheral nervous system, right? Okay. So that's one of the major differences between the efferent pathway of the somatic nervous system and the efferent pathway of the autonomic nervous system. Okay? All right. So up here, right, is our somatic motor nervous system, right? With our efferent pathway, here's our motor neuron. It starts off in the CNS, carries its signal all the way to the target tissue. And what neurotransmitters released? The acetylcholine. And at the neuromuscular junction, is acetylcholine excitatory or inhibitory? Excitatory. Yeah, absolutely. And so here's our autonomic nervous system. And so here we can break this up into sympathetic and parasympathetic division, right? Remember, for both of these, we need two neurons to get to our effector. Okay? Now, if you look at all the neurotransmitters that are being released, what is the most common one that you see up there? Acetylcholine, right? So it turns out, this is a gross oversimplification, but this is as far as the depth we're going to go into, right? All of this communication between effectors and neurons is acetylcholine for the autonomic nervous system, except for which division? So where do we see something other than acetylcholine? So in the sympathetic or the parasympathetic? The sympathetic, right? So here, the final, right, neurotransmitter that's getting released for the sympathetic is what? Epinephrine, norepinephrine, right? Okay? Everywhere else, it's always what? Acetylcholine, right? So remember, everything is acetylcholine except for what's being released from that postsynaptic or postganglionic neuron of the sympathetic nervous system. All right, everybody with me on that? Which means that for both sympathetic and parasympathetic, what neurotransmitter is being used to send a signal from the preganglionic to the postganglionic neuron. Acetylcholine in both cases, right? Okay? It's only this postganglionic neuron that's releasing something different in the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Everybody with me on this? It's going to help you with trying to remember what's going on. So by default, think about acetylcholine. The only difference or exception is going to be in the postganglionic neuron. All right? Of the sympathetic division. So here, the parasympathetic is always acetylcholine, right? Here, sympathetic, right? We have acetylcholine and then epinephrine, norepinephrine being released. And then we're going to talk about this guy because here, that preganglionic neuron actually is going to synapse in something called the adrenal medulla to cause this structure to release epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream. And if that gets in the bloodstream, it goes everywhere, right? It goes everywhere. Okay? This will be really important in just a second. Yeah, go ahead, Tyler. So here, this is releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine to the bloodstream, but this is going to be a more local transmitter to the SMOOM muscle that is part of part of the wall that's lining blood vessels. So here, we're going to get to this, but this is going everywhere once it gets in the bloodstream. This is going to be a little bit more localized. Is that what you're getting at? Oh, it's packaged in neurotransmitter vesicles. Just like what you saw before with acetylcholine. Instead of having those vesicles full of acetylcholine, they're full of epinephrine, norepinephrine. Yeah, got it. All right, any other questions? Okay, so this is kind of getting to the fact that epinephrine, norepinephrine get released into the bloodstream. And here, epinephrine, norepinephrine is longer lasting. It's inactivated more slowly than, say, the acetylcholine, which is more localized. All right? And so when you undergo sympathetic division activation, right? As soon as that bear goes away, does your heart rate automatically go down? Instantly? No. It stays elevated, right? You have this kind of extended sympathetic nervous system response. It's because there is going to be norepinephrine, epinephrine, circulating for a little bit longer than what we see with the parasympathetic division. And one of the reasons for this is that epinephrine, norepinephrine is in the blood, and it gets broken down in the liver once it's in the blood. Yeah, go ahead. We're going to get into a little bit more detail with the cardiovascular system, but absolutely, the beta adrenergic receptor, is targeted by, epinephrine, norepinephrine. Yep. Mm-hmm. And that is that epinephrine, norepinephrine that's targeting that is a little bit more local, rather than some of it's not as systemic. Coming from the systemic blood, norepinephrine, epinephrine. So we're going to definitely get into that with the cardiovascular. All right. So here, a lot of this is, if you remember, indirectly, right? Using a second messenger system. And so guess what receptor we're talking about? Type of receptor. G protein coupled receptor. Anytime I ask that, if you say G protein coupled receptor or GPCR, you're probably right. Especially if we're talking about a second messenger and indirect GPCR. Okay? And so remember with GPCRs or this indirect messenger signaling, the other reason this this activation is sustained longer is, remember, the second messenger, it also is making, is exaggerating or amplifying the response, right? So here for a single neurotransmitter binding to, or a hormone binding to a GPCR, we're making a lot of second messenger. It's amplifying the signal, and it's causing all sorts of effects within the cell. In order for those effects in the cell to get reset, it takes time to do that, right? So this is another major reason why here with this, the norepinephrine, epinephrine, it takes a longer time to come down from activating this system, right? And here, remember, acetylcholine gets broken down by acetylcholinesterase, which is in the synapse, right? So it's broken down fairly quickly. But if we have epinephrine, norepinephrine running through our blood system, it takes a while for that epinephrine, norepinephrine to get routed through the liver and then get broken down. It takes a little bit of time for that. So all of these reasons contribute to the sympathetic nervous system staying activated longer than the parasympathetic. Do any of these points not make sense to folks? How they contribute to the sympathetic nervous system staying activated longer? Any questions on any of those? Okay, good. Now, if something gets released in the bloodstream, it goes everywhere, right? Which means that sympathetic activation is going to be more systemic, and then the parasympathetic is much more localized. Right? So body-wide, we can have mobilization of a lot of things, right? Now, this is different than the parasympathetic. Parasympathetic, we have those postganglionic neurons that are actually getting really close to their targets, their effectors. And so the actual effectors, or the effects of the parasympathetic, are very much more localized. And just like what we saw before, right? Remember, only the sympathetics using that norepinephrine, epinephrine, right, as the postganglionic neurotransmitter or hormone. Sympathetic is. The parasympathetic's using acetylcholine, and it is releasing it very locally. And so acetylcholinesterase can quickly break it down. So parasympathetic is a little bit more directed, and it's much easier to reset that system, to get rid of the neurotransmitter here. So they're short-lived and highly localized. Okay? So we've talked about the two divisions, right? Parasympathetic and sympathetic, what their physiological responses are of those two divisions, some of the neurotransmitter and also pathway differences between the two. And then now we've looked at localized versus systemic differences, effects differences, right? Okay? All right. So there's a lot of things going on this slide. But just to draw in or couple to some of the things we talked about before with, say, cranial nerves. Okay? All right? So, and also spinal nerves. So it turns out that where we have the efferent nerves coming out of the spinal cord, out of the CNS, for the parasympathetic division, are going to be up here and down here. So we say these cranial nerves and these sacral nerves. So we say that here the anatomical distinction between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. The parasympathetic, you get these nerves, the efferent fibers, come out of the cranial region and the sacral region. So a lot of times it's referred to as cranial sacral divisions, okay? And hopefully what you see here is that a lot of these preganglionic neurons, they're really long. They almost reach all the way to their target or effector for the parasympathetic, okay? Which means that the postganglionic neurons don't have to span very much of a distance. So here we have long preganglionic neurons and short postganglionic neurons for the parasympathetic. Now, one of the things that helps with is that localized control of the parasympathetic. So think about, if you're driving along, if you're almost all the way to your destination, you don't have that many different options to get there, right? The further you're away, though, you could have a lot more different ways to get to your target. So it's one of the ways I remember how the parasympathetic, okay? So some of the cranial nerves that are involved, all right, oculomotor, which is involved with eye muscles, and we'll talk more about these when we get to special senses. The facial nerves involved with tears and salivation, right? Glossopharyngeal is also involved with salivation, and the vagus nerve is a big one. So if there's any one that you should definitely know for parasympathetic coming out of the cranial region, it's the vagus nerve. And so here, when we talk about divergence, the sympathetic, it's less divergent than the sympathetic, which means that it's much more localized. Okay, meaning that here, we're almost to the target. It's not going to spread out and go to a whole bunch of other targets. It's going to be very localized compared to the sympathetic. Okay. Now, it's a bit of a sandwich. So the parasympathetic is the cranial and sacral. So not surprisingly, in the middle of this sandwich, right, coming out in the middle, the thoracic and lumbar regions are going to be the sympathetic. Okay? Right. So here we have the parasympathetic is cranial, sacral, and then in between there is going to be the sympathetic, neurons coming out of the spinal cord. Okay? Right? So here's a sympathetic division. There's a lot going on. You don't have to memorize this. All I'm pointing out is here you see that this is thoracic and lumbar, right? This is showing us that these sympathetic fibers are coming out of the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. That's different than what we just saw with parasympathetic. So parasympathetic is coming out of the cranial and sacral regions, right? One of the other differences is that here the preganglionic neurons are relatively short, which means that the ganglia for the sympathetic division are right next to the spinal cord in the thoracic and lumbar regions. So if the preganglionic neurons are really short, it means that the ganglia are close to this spinal cord. And if we have short preganglionic neurons, it means that we have to have long postganglionic neurons to get to our effectors or targets. Okay? Which means that here, if we're starting off further away, there's more branching that can go on and affect more effectors and targets. Okay? Yeah, go ahead. That, I don't know. I know that it'll activate some of the mucus glands, and you can get thicker saliva. So for those that are athletes or out running, when you run, you kind of get drier saliva, and it's thicker. And one of the reasons is because you're decreasing the parasympathetic activation and you're promoting sympathetic activation. Yeah. All right. So here, there's once again is kind of flipped from what we saw with the parasympathetic, right? So we have short preganglionic neurons, long postganglionic neurons, and then we say that there are those ganglia associated with the sympathetic nervous system are right next to the spinal cord. And sometimes they're located in chains, and you can see that in some of the models in the lab. And so we can call this a sympathetic trunk or chain. All right? Now here, remember that no matter whether we're talking about sympathetic or parasympathetic, the neurotransmitter that's released from the preganglionic neuron is always what? Acetylcholine, right? The only difference is with the sympathetic division, the neurotransmitter getting released from the postganglionic neuron is usually going to be what? Epinephrine, norepinephrine. Parasympathetic, do we see epinephrine, norepinephrine released? No. So there, we're only seeing which neurotransmitter being released for the parasympathetic. Acetylcholine, right? Okay. All right, so why don't we take a break? Okay, so I think we'll continue our conversation here. For those that noticed, if you take a look at some of the targets for the parasympathetic and the sympathetic, you may have noticed that there's common targets, right? So if you take a look at parasympathetic, one of the targets is a lot of the digestive tract, the large intestine and the small intestine. And then if you go over and take a look at the sympathetic, you'll notice that the sympathetic also targets the same structures. So there's overlapping structures that are targeted by parasympathetic and sympathetic. All right? And so we're going to talk about what happens at these targets, these effectors, that are what we say dual innervated. They're innervated both parasympathetic and sympathetic. All right? And so one of these is the digestive system. If you look at the large intestine and small intestine, for instance, okay? It's innervated by both sympathetic and parasympathetic. Controls some of the reflexes that are, or influences the reflexes that are housed there that influence digestive movement. So, turns out there's reflexes for moving food through our intestine that don't even need to go to the central nervous system. And so this is called the enteric nervous system. Right? But parasympathetic and sympathetic can kind of influence these visceral localized reflexes. So I fibbed to you guys a little bit when I was telling you that sympathetic and parasympathetic, right, directly influence, movement of food. It turns out that there's a huge neuronal network in our guts, so much so that a lot of scientists call it the second brain. And a lot of what it does is it allows reflexes to move food through our intestines, via reflexes, I should say, without needing to go through the central nervous system. But we can, the autonomic nervous system can influence what happens there, in the digestive system, right? So here, some of these are visceral reflexes. They're coordinated locally. So like I said, without the CNS, it's a huge network of neurons there. Now, parasympathetic, would you expect that to promote digestion? Parasympathetic? Yeah, absolutely, right? Sympathetic, what would you predict? So, decreased motility, decreased, say, mucus secretion, and so forth, right? So all of those things. So increasing that contraction rate to move things, release of enzymes to break down larger foodstuffs into smaller things. Turns out in order to absorb nutrients from our intestine, it needs to be broken down into the subunits, like proteins need to be broken down into amino acids and so forth in order to be absorbed. In order to do that, we have to have certain digestive enzymes and chemicals to do that. Not surprisingly, sympathetic is going to push the brakes on all of this, right? So it's going to decrease gastrointestinal movement, release of digestive chemicals, right? All right. Does that make sense to folks? Everybody on board with that? Yeah, Tyler. Well, that's probably coming, it's a little bit debatable. So I've looked into the hiccups because that question's come up before on exactly what's causing it. But part of that has to do with their brainstem as well. You know, that there seems to be a disconnect, you know, in the swallowing that goes on, and they try to reset that network. You know, but yeah, there's some component where the CNS is involved. All right. So another dual innervation is the pupil reflex, right? So here, you're out and about and you run to a bear, right? Sympathetic nervous system gets activated. Your pupils are going to dilate, right? Get larger. So you can find an exit route, right? If it's twilight, for instance. Parasympathetic, though, resting and digesting, pupils get constricted, right? So here, you know, the pupil dilation, you have parasympathetic and sympathetic innervation. Now, in this case, there's two separate muscles that are innervated. So here, the parasympathetic, right, is going to be causing the muscle, the constrictor muscle, okay, to contract. It is going to be constricting the pupil. With the sympathetic, you get that muscle being relaxed, and you get another muscle being activated that's going to be opening up the iris so your pupil gets larger. So here, okay, we have a different muscle that is going to be a dilator muscle to open up the iris. Okay. So this dual innervation. We're just going to go through a few examples. There's a lot more examples in our body of this, right? So here, there's antagonistic effects, we say. So one effect is to constrict the pupil, the other effect is to dilate it, right? And here, they're affecting the same effector cells. So here, we can talk about heart muscle as an example of that, okay? Here, we're talking about different muscles, right? Different cells. So regulation of pupil size that I just went over, right? So regulation of heart rate, okay, right, is dual innervation, but we have the same effector cells. And when we get the cardiovascular section, we'll talk about why that is. So the target cells are the same. Here we're talking about dilation or constriction of the pupil, where the target cells are different for each one of the divisions. Is that making sense to folks? All right, I'm not sure I'm explaining that too well. But here the effectors are two separate ones. One effector is constricting to limit the pupil size, right, for parasympathetic. The other effector, okay, is getting activated to hold or pull that iris further open in order to make that pupil, which is a hole, okay, larger. Okay. So here we have a constrictor versus a dilator muscle, right? Two separate targets for each of the divisions of the autonomic nervous system. We can get opposite effects of the two divisions if they have the same target. That's what this example is mentioning, the same target tissue. All right? Okay. So, cooperative effects. So we talked about opposite effects, but what about having a common cooperative effect? Right? So here, we've talked about antagonistic effects, but there also can be cooperative effects. So the two divisions act on separate structures for a unified effect. So an example is going to be reproduction, all right, for, for instance, erection and then ejaculation, right? So here, how do you remember this? You may wonder why I have a gun over there shooting. So here, pointing, shooting. Parasympathetic, sympathetic, right? So parasympathetic's involved with pointing, sympathetic's involved with shooting. Okay, all right? So combined for a common effect, right? So orgasm is going to be a combination of parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system together. All right, so we've talked about opposite effects, dual innervation, and we talked a little bit about cooperative effects with dual innervation. And turns out you can get opposite effects with the same division as well, okay, without dual innervation. So blood vessel diameter. Blood vessel diameter. Turns out sympathetic nervous system governs blood vessel diameter solely. So it turns out the sympathetic nervous system, what it does is it has tonic firing to be able to make sure that there's some tone, some small constriction of smooth muscle that's in the walls of the blood vessels. If that firing decreases, the rate decreases, what happens to that constriction? It goes less, which means that the blood vessels get larger. They dilate. Okay? Right? Now, if we increase, right, if we increase that sympathetic firing rate, what happens to the contraction of those smooth muscles? The contraction goes up, which means what happens to the diameter? It gets smaller, right? So here, the blood vessel diameter is controlled just by the sympathetic nervous system firing rate. So it starts off with some steady tonic firing, and then if it goes up, and the blood vessel diameter decreases, and if it decreases, that firing rate becomes less, then the blood vessels dilate, right? Does that make sense to folks? Right? We can get opposite effects just with the same division. We start off with just having tonic firing of those sympathetic postganglionic neurons. Okay? So decreased firing, we get vasodilation. Increased firing, we get vasoconstriction. All right. So we're going to be winding up here. So for those out there, if you're going to be encountering individuals that may come in contact with poisons or certain types of drugs, right, they can mimic or antagonize one of these divisions. So when we talk about mimicking one of these divisions, we call those drugs mimetics of that division. So we can talk about sympathomimetics, right? So what is someone who's taking a sympathomimetic? What would that look like? So what types of physiological response would you guys expect? What's that? Yeah, exactly. So elevated heart rate. What about blood glucose levels? What would you expect there? Should go up. Pupils. Yeah, so it should be dilated, right? Bronchioles. What do you guys think? Dilate, yeah, absolutely. Right? Okay? Right? So all of those things. Someone taking a sympathomimetic. What if So if we talk about antagonizing one of these divisions, we call that a lytic. So here we can talk about a sympatholytic, suppresses sympathetic activity, right? So here, this is getting to, what Charles was asking about beta blockers, right? They're going to be able to block or dampen the sympathetic nervous response. So someone who's got a sympatholytic on board in their bloodstream, okay, they go out hiking, they see a bear. Is their heart rate going to go up as much as if they didn't have that on board? Probably not, right? Because we're blocking that effect. So sympatholytics, right? So beta blockers is an example of that. We'll talk more about the details when we get to the cardiovascular system. So it shouldn't surprise you guys that we can also have drugs to promote the activity of the parasympathetic nervous system. So remember, we can talk about agonists and antagonists, but we could also somehow try to increase the amount of neurotransmitter, right? By decreasing reuptake or decreasing the chemical breakdown, right? Those two can be mimetics, right? So here, one example is this drug pilocarpine. It's involved that can be used to relieve glaucoma by dilating blood vessels. So glaucoma is increased pressure in the eye, and to decrease that pressure, you dilate blood vessels to try to remove a lot of that increased pressure is caused by elevated amount of liquid. Okay? So dilation. Hopefully this makes sense to folks. So not surprisingly, we have mimetics for the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. We can talk about also sympatholytics, which inhibit the sympathetic nervous system. We can also talk about parasympatholytics, right? They suppress the activity. So atropine is an example that's been used. For those that are going to be in the emergency medical services, you use atropine. So one of the common drugs you have on a crash cart, right? Used to dilate pupils for eye exams, and also it's going to be involved to decrease salivation as well as other things. All right? Now, there's natural compounds out there that can promote acetylcholine, right? Or bind to the acetylcholine receptors on effectors of the parasympathetic nervous system, right? So those would be, if they're agonists, they would be parasympathomimetics, right? So there's a mushroom poison that does that. Individuals that consume this, what would that look like? So if you're activating the parasympathetic nervous system, someone walks in, right? What is that patient going to exhibit? What physiological responses are you going to see? What do you think? Activating the parasympathetic nervous system. What's that? No, just the parasympathetic nervous system. Yeah. So what does the parasympathetic nervous system do? What's it involved with? So, fight or flight? No. Parasympathetic is involved with resting and digesting, right? Okay? So, what are some of the D words that we saw with the parasympathetic nervous system? Yeah, diuresis. So, urination. Increase urination. So, someone who's taking that poison, right, that's activating the parasympathetic nervous system, right? Increase urination. What else? Defecation, right? It's not a pleasant physiological response, right? So you probably want to avoid parasympathomimetics out there. Okay, so let's take a look at kind of doing a review here, okay? All right. So if we take a look at heart rate, let's just go down heart rate, parasympathetic versus sympathetic. Parasympathetic, should that go up or down? We'll just put arrows. Down. Parasympathetic should go up, right? Blood pressure, up or down? So down for parasympathetic. What about sympathetic? Up. So if you wanted to treat someone that has elevated blood pressure, right, would you want to promote or inhibit the sympathetic nervous system? Inhibit it, right? Okay? All right, breathing rate. Parasympathetic, what would we expect? Should go down. So now I can write on the board here. Okay, breathing rate for the sympathetic should go up. Blood glucose. So for parasympathetic, what would we expect? So here, blood glucose should go down. Now if I ask the related question, what about glycogen production? So here, glycogen production should go up here, and it should be reduced here, right? But blood glucose, right, should go up there, right? Everybody with me so far? Okay. Metabolic rate. So parasympathetic, what would we be expecting here? Should go down. Metabolic rate should go up over here. So hopefully you guys start seeing a trend here. Okay? Blood to skeletal muscle should go down with parasympathetic. What about over here? Should go up, right? Okay. Sweat production. So here, parasympathetic, we should see it go down. Sweat production and sympathetic, what do we expect? Should go up. Release of epinephrine, norepinephrine. So down. Right? Here we should see that go up. Pupils. So here, talk about pupil diameter. All right? Should we see that go up or down? Should go down here. So let me write pupil diameter, so you guys are clear about that. The pupil diameter should go up over here. Bronchioles, so bronchial diameter, right? So for the parasympathetic, what would we expect? Down. So someone, or let's finish this up. So here, this bronchial diameter should increase, right? So if someone has asthma, right, would you want to promote bronchial dilation or restrict it? Promote it. So would you want to give them something that is activating or inhibiting the sympathetic innervation there of the bronchioles? Yeah. Bronchodilator, right? Okay. So cranial nerve 10. So here, the vagus nerve. That activation for the parasympathetic, is that increased or decreased? What's that? Increased. Yeah, that's a major parasympathetic nerve. So here, remember, the parasympathetic comes out of the cranial and sacral. Okay? So here, if we're talking about a lot of these cranial nerves, they're parasympathetic, right? Activation for the cranial nerve for a sympathetic is going to be decreased, right? All right. So what about digestion? For parasympathetic, we should see that being elevated. Digestion response here should go down, right? Saliva production for parasympathetic should go up, right? Here, saliva production for the sympathetic should go down. Right? So here, urination and defecation for parasympathetic, you would expect that to be elevated, and correspondingly, you should see that decreased for the sympathetic. All right? So be sure to go through these and be able to write, would you expect it to go up or down? Right? Hopefully it makes sense. Please review what we talked about today And if anything doesn't make sense when you guys review it, bring those questions to class next week, all right? The remaining slides in here for those that want more details, okay? So there's a whole bunch of variations of this. You're not required to know it at all. Some people like to dig a little bit deeper. You're welcome to take a look at them.